In winter, when I put a kilt over myself, its shadows on the wall seem to sway like an elephant. That sends my mind racing into the labyrinth of times past. Memories come crowding in. Dear friends, this is how Ismat Shuktai begins the story called Lihaf, which in English translation by Professor Asasuddin is termed as the kilt and is going to be the very core of our first interaction in today's discussion. This text we take up as a primary example of modern Indian fiction in English translation. In doing so, we not only get to enter into exploring the vicissitudes of the nuances of this modern literary fiction, but in addition to it, we tend to look at how ideas, concepts, words, and lives flow from one language to another in establishing what is considered as one of the most path-breaking and controversial piece of literature coming down to us from pre-independence India. Dear friends, in our discussion of the story of the kilt, I believe it would be helpful for all of us to try and begin with a very brief summary of the major plot of the story. So, this is a story which is narrated by a woman who is recalling an event from her childhood. In her childhood, when she was a young girl, we are told that her mother leaves her at the home of a certain Begum Jan, a beautiful but neglected wife of an aristocratic Nawab. Although the Nawab seemed to have had a very, very distinct public reputation of religious virtue as well as moral refinement, we are also informed that he ignores his wife completely and instead surrounds himself with attractive young men. On account of this forced isolation, Begum Jan, we find, endlessly grows sickly, restless, and emotionally starved. Her physical and emotional revival, however, begins when she starts building up an intense relationship with her mate, who in the story is called Rabbu. Rabbu massages her continuously with special oils and herbs and attends to her body. Rabbu becomes Begum Jan's sole companion, and her physical attention transforms Begum's appearance, her mood, and her desires for body. The child narrator, who initially begins to adore Begum Jan, gradually becomes disturbed by the interactions which tends to happen between Begum Jan and Rabbu. She sleeps nearby, often in the same room where Begum Jan and Rabbu retire for the night, and repeatedly sees the kilt shaking and changing shape in the dark. The anomaly is that she constantly keeps on referring it to as a large animal which is trapped underneath. We would come to the metaphorical symbolism of all these images that Chuktai seems to whirl upon with the stroke of his master pen. But this child who succumbs herself to whispers and strange sounds does not understand the meaning, only that something frightened and secret is happening between Begum Jan and Rabbu. When Rabbu goes away for a short visit, Begum Jan becomes distraught. She is unable to sleep or eat anything. She makes the narrator massage her, and the child becomes very uncomfortable and frightened by the intense bodily reactions of the Begum. When Rabbu finally returns, the nightly disturbances resume. One night, unable to ignore her own terror, the child switches on the light of the room as the kilt seems to be rising heavily up and down in the air. What she seems remains unstated in the story, but the shock confirms that the mysterious movements are not a dream but a reality of their shared existence. The story ends at this moment of revelation through the terrified eyes of the child, now at a later stage in her life, and recounting this piece of growing up into experience without moral judgment or the sense of exploration, leaving the unsaid to be spoken by itself. This, my dear friends, is a brief summary of the story, which in the English translation is called The Kilt and in Urdu is called Rihaf. I believe if we are to be taking up the elementary codes which has been placed by the brief summary of the story, it might be interesting to unravel and resolve the metaphorical connections which the author seems to use as a bridge between the contemporary society of Chuktai's life and the larger narratorial framework of the story. The kilt in the story, quite uncannily then, we find is introduced right at the beginning of this piece. And it is a domestic object. The kilt, a piece of everyday life, is something which is not monstrous, rather comforting. However, the metaphor of it tending to appear as an elephant thrashing itself on the wall is a central trope that Chuktai seems to build across the length and breadth of her narrative. The fact that this memory of the kilt transforming into an elephant is constantly triggered visually, morally, shadows a sort of phantasm and Gothic response to the narrative. The narrator disclaims the romanticism which Rabbu or Begum Jan is able to try and establish with the kilt. Rather, to the young child, the kilt in itself becomes a metaphor of irony. A piece of cloth which is withheld from her, and she, in her way, is censored and access to it. This is the novella's key stylistic strategy to try and talk about repressed desires of the body under the colonial obscenity regimes. will definitely try and return to the idea of the trial on obscenity that Chugtai and Manto herself has to go through in the 1940s on account of this text and other specimens for sure. But I believe it is important for us to consider later at some point perhaps that the idea of the modern India and the modern Indian fiction was largely dependent on how to try and separate it from what it tend to look up as dirty and obscenity. We would come to an understanding of how certain traits of our medieval existence had intertwined with the colonial awakening to a certain modern consciousness and the tension between these two poles in a later point of her analysis, perhaps. Moving on from the idea of the kilt, if we are to try and look at the idea of how the child's mother seems to deposit her with Begum Jan and how the young child tends to think of this as a domestic punishment. I would rather argue that this idea of the domestic punishment in the larger narratorial framework of the story is a plot device in itself. Who is not punished in this domestic arena of the Nawab's quarters? The mother sends the child to Begum Jan, and the child realizes that there is no one here with whom she could fight, meaning there are no boys, foreshadowing the threat that the Begum's quarters is actually a female space. And the patriarchal protection that seemed to be pushing the narrator towards the queer exposure of Begum Jan and Rabbo is something that seems to be coming down to the child as a wound, the scar of which she would carry as a trauma and a mark of memory. We also tend to try and look at the Nawab's character through Begum Jan's remarks on his existence. The Nawab's open house for boys, I'm sure our learned audience here will be able to equate with the Bachabazi code in elite Lucknow culture. The fact that the narrator describes the boys to be aesthetically attractive and eroticizing rather the male form tends to confirm the idea of a similar simultaneous homoerotic consumption which exists between Begum and Rabbo. But when it is presented through a child's perception, it is interesting that how the element of satire in these narratorial visuals are heightened to an extent so that it appears that for the same code of conduct, whereas the Nawab as a patriarch is able to establish his own code of desire, the queer male gaze confirms that when it is two women trying to exert their own right and accessibility to the pleasure of their body, they have to, without any further choice, fill themselves up beneath the kilt. We also get to know that how Begum Jan's life has been reduced to nothing but a long perpetual wait out of this marriage that she had to succumb to. Uh, the idea that her womanhood chronologically means nothing to the patriarchal structure of the Nawab and his court of boys leads to the fact that none of the accepted codes of patriarchy, birth, marriage, sexual initiation, can grant subjectivity to her existence. Rather, she tends to find a life of her own only when she is in the company of her partner, Rabbo. Uh, Ismat Chugtai, with the kind of jest for life she had in her real existence as well as in her authorial presence across the several narratives she has been able to pen down, have always been very particular to try and use the objects of everyday life in a symbolic manner. Lihaf, which in translation comes to be called the kilt, doesn't seem to fall away in this regard too. To the extent we see that the use of everyday objects like food, like clothes, seems to be infused with a certain metaphorical presence of their own when Chugtai picks up the pace. For instance, when we have a mention of the clothes, whether it is of the young adolescent boy or the flowing robes of silk with which Begum Jan loves to adorn her own body and offers some to the child narrator, represent the male gaze and the economy of display, which is perhaps most suitable to the social status of the Nawab. But at the same time, when this female gaze withdraws itself, it is obvious that the female subjectivity would only collapse and the true sight of female love and bonding would evolve out of that gap. There are other characters who are introduced in this story. For instance, the relatives or the Nawab, which Begum Jan constantly states as to be social parasites, right? Let us not be indignant of the social system of the Nawabi Gharana, which comes from a feudal ecosystem of freeloaders in this respect. While Begum Jan herself is a prisoner in this system of abundance, food becomes a symbol both for desire as well as deprivation. And the fine idea that the Begum freezes despite of the new kilt being offered to her also refers to the sensory metaphor of emotional coldness, which no warm food of this world or no invigorating drink could try and work as a substitute for. I believe the different kind of metaphors that Ismet is able to try and bring in her rendering of the tale constitutes a very visceral experience, almost at the level of sensorial presence for sure, which she is eager to share with the readers of her story. Begum Jan is a spectacle to the male fantasy for sure, but at the same time, where she is not subjected to the male gaze, her body is a site of power. The narrator's fascination with all these different elements, which are tactile, which are visual, which are oral, which are sensorial, also seems to be coded in this language of admiration that covers the story from the beginning to the end. Chuktai, the liberated woman she is, also brings in other issues of women's life in her rendering of the characters in this story. We find that Rabbu's job is to constantly rub the Begum with medical oils. This is a corporeal dedication, right? It's a very clear domestic contract which exists between the Begum and Rabbu, but this is also Rabbu's employment. Rabbu, unlike Begum, is a working woman, and Rabbu's labor then seems to try and form a certain idea of erotic economy which the narrator is full of disgust for on the account of her innocence. If you tend to think of, the words that the Begum constantly uses to try and make Rabbu feel useful in this circuit of erotic economy, are words like itch, words like rub, words like vigor. And all these words tend to exist in the plot as a metaphor for sexual need and desire. If we tend to critically look at the idea of the itch, for instance, the itch can be read as a somatic metaphor for desire, but at the same time, it could also try and exist as a social commentary on the unfulfilled life of women like Begum Jan, in whom the doctors find nothing wrong with their somatic ailments for sure, and if the doctors are to be looked upon as a larger metaphor of patriarchy, then they refuses to diagnose the erotic demand of the female body. Rabbu here appears as a lover who tends to approach Begum Jan's illness with care and empathy. She is a rustic woman who is a healer through remedies known to the folk, and which is why to Begum's all ailments, Rabbu works as the anesthetic. There's the physical contrast between Rabbu and the Begum, which I believe Chuktai beautifully standardizes on the basis of their bodily appearance. But their upset hierarchy is very, very radical. And I believe the strength of their love is such that they are able to outweigh all other kind of differences which otherwise would not allow a woman from a lower class to gain control over the elite body of the Begum Jan. In trying to authorize this sensorial claim over the beauty capital of the Begum Jan, I believe the kilt, again, returning to the title of the story, acts both as a shield and as a secret. Perhaps, we don't know, the writer wants to enable an enclosure through this piece of cloth. This piece of cloth which indicates that here is a space where the policy of female desire is independent and free by its ill. We see that at a certain point in the story, in Rabbu's absence, the child narrator becomes a substitute for Rabbu. This is a pivotal transgression. The narrator is recruited into Rabbu's function, but without any erotic intention for sure. This is made very, very clear in the larger narrative of the story. But there is also a certain ethical boundary that Chugtai is able to create in the functionalities of these women. The narrator is naive, excited by the approval, and unaware by the implications of the move. Begum Jan, who is in control and uses the language of sensuality masked as bodily pain, does not allow herself to transcend beyond the boundary of coexistence in this regard. And the sexual scripting of the incident between the young narrator and the Begum Jan is placed almost at a transactional boundary where the child is equated with a doll or a babua, almost to compensate this intimacy through the idea of a gift from an olden patron to a younger body. This forced closeness, this bodily inspection could try and be a deeply uncomfortable paragraph for the readers of the story. But I believe the translution of the body and the imagery of the doe and the gender blur that is created in this part of the story is a moment where innocence recognizes what experience may be. And there is a flight in the room. Rabbu returns and the quelled terror intensifies with the return of the Rabbu. There is perfuming, there is dressing, there is over-adorning which is back, and we find that Begum gives away herself to a violent fit. And we reach the final eruption, which almost, appears to us like a cinematic shadow performance, where the narrator misrecognizes desire as gluttony. And there is a sensory confusion between the attar in the air, between the imagined food and the act of love, which seems to be taking over the narrative at this point of time. So, what is Chugtai able to achieve at this point? Of course, she writes about desire without naming it, uses as a child narrator, both as a shield but also as a critique to what she experiences as a person. She exposes the sexual hypocrisy of elite men, not only in trying to talk about the Nawab and his court of young boys, but also by projecting herself to the male gaze of female subjectivity. At the same time, she reclaims female agency while interrogating the violence it tends to represent in the narrative line of the story. She insists that patriarchy mutilates all genders, which is why the kilt in the story, almost evolves as an archive of forbidden bodies, of forbidden desires, of acts of love which may exist but cannot be discussed in public. Um, I believe that the essence of the story is held in its rendition in the Urdu dialect. And though Professor Asad Uddin seems to exercise quite a feat of achievement in able to try and transform the narrative into its English body, I'm sure in the next session, when we tend to look at how this language of desire, which is represented through metaphors and symbols of the bodily act of love, when compared by the use of Urdu and its translated appearance in English, it will allow us to lead to the idea of how dirtiness and obscenity tends to run in our models of language. And I believe when we do so in one of the future occasions, we will also be able to pick up from that quote the notion of what is obscene and what is modern. In doing so, I'm sure we would love to reach out to the medieval canon of Hindi literature and expose ourselves to the colonial gaze of knowledge economy, which tends to redirect our own understanding of our traditional knowledge systems. With these thoughts in our mind, let's call it a day. Thank you so much.